Keogh, who is a Canadian colleague, who is a founder and principal advisor of Toronto-based Shantalla Inc, which is a niche advisory and research firm. John has tremendous experience in the supply chain in the agri-food sector in particular. He has been holding many executive leadership roles in IT, supply chain, technology consultant, and industry standard. And more recently, after having accumulated a few master's degrees, embark into a PhD to study transparency and trust in the food chain, which I'm told is almost completed. So his talk today, transparency and trust in the food chain, the importance of digitization and convergence to facilitate Society 5.0 goal. I will let him explain what is meant by Society 5.0 and present the wealth of knowledge and experience that he will be sharing with us. Before I shift to him, a few logistic detail. We typically go through the presentation for the first 45 minutes, 50 minutes, uninterrupted unless there is some drama. And then we move to a long period of questions because it's not a webinar just for giving information. It's a webinar for exchanging and advancing this convergence agenda. So with no further introduction, John, I'm very pleased to welcome you, and I'm shifting to you.
Wonderful, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
I presume everyone can hear me okay. I see some familiar names and faces on the line. Breach, Sahi, Alicia, Noel, so welcome, and welcome to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. What I'd like to do is just show you the agenda first that I will go through. I'll go through food chain complexity. I'll show you a few slides around that. Then I'll look at the complex topic of technology. I'll look at the data problem, which is at the core of a lot of this. And I'm going to pick on blockchain today just to elaborate on different perspectives. We're still hearing a lot of hype on blockchain. It is calming down a little bit, but I want to give you some perspectives on that. Then I'll go into transparency. I'll talk about a definition of it, and I'll talk about what does that actually mean. I'll have an extended discussion on trust and why that's important. And then that will lead into one of the critical factors in developing Society 5.0 and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is trust. I'll look at a few use cases and how innovation is preparing us for Society 5.0. And then I'll summarize. My very last slide is the only theoretical one, where I will pull together both transparency and trust in one slide, and I'll discuss that. So I'll probably go for 45 to 50 minutes, I think maybe 50 minutes in total. So on that, let's look at the food chain complexity. This is what we know today. This is our food chain. I've been using this slide for maybe a dozen years. And it's always unusual. We can talk about this for the whole day. If you envision yourself sitting down at a dinner with your family and you have a plate of food, you're wondering, where did it come from? Well, the supply chain here is quite complex. If you see the potatoes here, the yellow supply chain, I know they look like eggs, but they're potatoes. We understand that they come from, you buy them in a shop, you buy them in a mall, they buy them from a wholesaler who gets them from a packer who grades them and sometimes washes them and puts them in packs, and they come from a farm. Now look at all the inputs that go into a farm. It's quite significant. And when we look at supply chains like this, we typically, this is obviously an aggregate level, but what's behind this is multiple countries, multiple languages, multiple technologies, and many different regulatory frameworks. That is really a smorgasbord, it's very, very difficult to do things like traceability, effectively recall. And way over on the left-hand side, and this is something that many don't even think about, we have chemicals coming into farms as well in the shape of insecticide, herbicide, pesticides, and fertilizers. And believe it or not, we also have fake insecticides, we have fake herbicide, we have fake pesticide, and we have fake fertilizer. So when these things are coming into the farm, the inputs into the farm are as critically important as what happens on the farm and what comes out of the farm as well. So agencies like World Customs Organization are trying to address these problems. But then the complexity starts at that point. So you're presented with a fish and you're paying a little bit more, but you don't know if it's wild or farmed. The label may say it's wild, it costs a couple of dollars more, but you don't know as a consumer. In a lot of cases, we don't know what species of fish we're looking at, especially if it's processed and filleted. Then we get into issues around animal feed. Is it safe? Is our milk diluted or adulterated? And Breach Sahi from Swiss Decode is on the phone, and they've looked at this problem of milk dilution and adulteration. So they've actually come up with mobile testing, which is quite clever, that will look for plant DNA in milk. Now, there should be no plant DNA in milk. And likewise, when you have plant-based milks, there should be no animal DNA in that milk as well. But we find a lot of problems in milk in countries like India and beyond. Is my animal feed safe? Well, guess what? I was living in Vietnam for 6 years up to last year. And the laboratory that I was working in, they found melamine in animal feed in Vietnam, which is quite surprising. So that problem hasn't gone away. Is my food really organic? Is there heavy metal contamination? You know, there's things that we take for granted, like eating rice. But, you know, 3 years ago, I was with the FDA at a conference, and they said children under 3 years of age should not be consuming rice because of the inorganic arsenic that's in the rice, and in some cases in very high quantities. There was an expose by Canadian Marketplace program last year, and they found significant levels of inorganic arsenic in Canadian rice products, which is quite surprising. So, and then it goes on, and all of these things, they complicate our supply chain. So is my honey pure or adulterated? Well, the Canadian government announced last summer they found a significant amount of fake honey coming into Canada, and they blocked it. Are there allergens present in my food? Now, a lot of these, the reason I'm going through these a little bit slower is that you have some companies, especially in the area of blockchain, saying they can guarantee that a product is from a particular country. So rice, is the rice or coffee from Vietnam? And they'll say their blockchain can do it. Well, they cannot. A blockchain cannot guarantee anything. A blockchain gives you data provenance, but it does not give you the actual physical provenance of the product. So I'll give you an example of that. When I was living in Vietnam, you have traders who would buy cheap carrots and potatoes from China. They would roll them in the local dirt, and then they would try to sell them as local products. If they put that on a blockchain, it would be exactly the same. You're saying that the data provenance starts in Vietnam, but the actual provenance of the product, which can only be tested with analytical chemistry, the carbon-13 analysis of the product, that will tell you where the product actually is physically from and where it was grown. So this is one of my biggest critiques of some of the technology companies, not all of them, but some of them don't really embed and don't really understand that we need to have a balance of technologies, various technologies, and also analytical chemistry to close the loop. And companies like Swiss Decode are taking the laboratories out into the field. Another company in Australia, Certain, also doing a similar type work from the laboratory perspective. Ultimately, what we want to know is my food safe to eat? So it's a complex picture, and I'll come back to that in different discussions later. So what I'm presenting here now is something that we have to look at. We have to look at not only the credence attributes like the food quality and food safety, but we have to look at the 5 main pillars of the food system. And why is that? It's because when we're dealing with issues of food quality or food safety or food fraud, The interventions are very different. The technologies you will use are different. The training of your staff is also quite different. And for those who are not familiar with food defense, think of food defense as counterterrorism. Think of food fraud as countercriminal. Now, food security, of course, is the ongoing supply of safe, affordable, and nutritious foods to meet the daily needs. But that's been sized by the UN FAO as about $940 billion. This is food waste. And in fact, we call it food loss and food waste. Food loss is pre-consumer phases. And in the consumer phases where the product is edible, we call that waste. So food loss and food waste, just as a note. Food fraud is quite significant. Now, this number here between 10 and 50 billion is significantly understated. We don't know the size of food fraud worldwide. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency have on their website that it's likely about 10% of all commercially sold food is fraudulent in some way, shape, or form. And on food safety, the World Bank in 2028 suggested that the cost of that just for low to middle income countries is about $110 billion. So this picture starts to build and build and build. And of course, if the food is unsafe, it's not food. That's something that people often say. If it's not safe, it's not food. So here's a look at Canada. And in the US, it's multitudes larger than this. But 1 in 8 people in Canada will get sick, about 4 million a year. And 11,500 will end up in hospital and 240 will die. Now, just to put that in context with the US has got 40 million illnesses per year, foodborne illnesses per year, 128,000 hospitalizations and about 3,000 deaths. But we know where they're coming from. Norovirus is about 1 million. Listeria is actually quite small, but you see the death rate is the highest. Salmonella, E. coli, and also Campylobacter. So when we know where these problems are, then we can start thinking about how can we use technology like AI and other technologies to be able to help us and do predictive analysis or analytics of where an outbreak may occur. And in the US, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, USDA and FDA are now mapping the viruses and the pathogens across the US. So in context of a supply chain where we trace products based on the barcode, or you can trace the product provenance based on the carbon analysis of the product, they're actually doing whole genome sequencing on the actual pathogen itself and tracing it back to a physical geography. And then they're looking at simulations around, well, what would happen if a floodplain flooded another area, or if a field got flooded, could that carry pathogens and bacteria around the US? So these are important things that are happening in the US, and we'll hear more about that in the next while. But very, very interesting, rapid whole genome sequencing of the pathogen itself. So moving on from that, so do we have food fraud? This is just an example of oregano in Australia. And yes, you can see on the right-hand side, less than 10% of oregano in that actual product. So we have significant adulteration. I brought oregano from about 7 or 8 different countries and sent it to Queen's University in Belfast for testing. And all of them were adulterated, which is quite shocking. Some of them, in my case, were more than 50% adulterated. And the adulterants are things like myrtle leaf, which has a place in traditional Chinese medicine for another purpose. So we have a lot of fraud going on. We also know that it's very, very difficult when products are processed to know the actual origin of those products. And of course, we've had scandals like the Horsegate scandal in Europe, or the horse meat scandal in Europe. Now, on this one here, this is credence claims. I want to just explain briefly what a credence claim is. These are all the claims that you can make on a product. From an economic theory perspective, you have three classes of attributes for a product. You have search attributes, experience attributes, and credence attributes. Search attributes about a product are information that's freely available that you can find yourself. Experience attributes are where the company is saying that their product is can help lower cholesterol, can make you healthier, and so on and so forth. So you physically have to buy or consume that product to experience that attribute. And then you have these ones here, which are credence claims. And the reason we call them credence claims is that the consumer can never verify before or after they purchase. And that's the issue. And what I'm pointing out here is that we have single practice credence claims like antibiotic-free or cage-free eggs. And we also have a set of practices, or multi-practices, like halal, for example, where the actual factory has to get certified, and then the product has to get certified as well separately. So it becomes very, very complex. And when we have credence claims like USDA organic, because it's associated with the government, we say that it has high signaling, or very strong signaling to a consumer of trust. So the signaling to a consumer of trust in that product, if it has USDA organic, is what we call very strong. But the issue with that, when you have a strong credence claim, the issue is that it's vulnerable for fraud. So now what the USDA do is they actually publish a list of fake USDA organic. So this is something that is an issue. And of course, the more feet you have on the street, I was picking up some products in Malaysia that were claiming to be USDA organic, and of course they were not. You have to be able to report those back to that company, back to the USDA, and get that company listed and report it. So we need a lot more feet on the street. We can't just rely on the agencies to do all of that themselves. And of course, we had some recent scandals again in Canada. There are some questions around the methodology used for this, but it just points out that we still have issues in our fish chain. We still have fraud that happens at various levels. The closer we get to the consumer, the more the fraud appears to occur. Honey, as I mentioned earlier, and spices, and there are several other areas that are rampant, where fraud is rampant. Now, technology complexity. Here's the picture we have. We have a couple of buzzwords like democratization, decentralization, disintermediation, and driving towards convergence, with the risk of mass surveillance and, of course, privacy issues. Now, to explain, democratization is just broader access to the technology. We've democratized the internet. Smaller companies now are getting access to low-fee platforms where they can do a significant, a lot more with their business and connect to global value chains. And of course, disintermediation is about eliminating the middleman, but in some cases, we're driving towards re-intermediation, where people are helping us in the middle. So it's a very, very complex picture that we're building. And of course, IoT connected up with trucks, with cars, with people, and we're advancing at a very, very rapid pace. A lot of people will say now, okay, so we've had the blockchain hype, and now we're getting into the 5G hype. Well, the 5G promises a lot of benefit, but here we also have to be cautious as well. It will offer us massive throughput, so very much faster, but the signals won't be sent that far. Plus, we're going to need a massive amount of new antennas to get coverage. Now, what is interesting and what's developing here, if you talk about farming and rural farming, you can have a combination of satellites with drones and a 5G network, which can actually extend coverage out into remote areas. And there's a lot of work going on in Europe, in the UK, also in different places around the world, to look at how do we take the benefits of 5G, how do we utilize satellites, and how do we utilize drones to be able to extend coverage out to rural areas that don't have coverage today. So a lot happening in that area. The big issue from my perspective is interoperability. How do you get all of these things connected together? This is the single biggest issue. And of course, before you can get into interoperability, you have to get the data right. And I'll talk about that in a few moments. And when you start talking about Society 5.0, which I'll come to later, in smart cities, the big issue is around orchestration. So what we have in Toronto right now, we have experimentation with autonomous traffic lights. But something needs to control those. So if you want to schedule delivery into stores based on a just-in-time philosophy, then you need to make sure that you're optimizing the route you will take, and even that that traffic light knows that you're coming and that knows that you have a perishable cargo to be able to facilitate the transportation to the endpoint. Think of Japan, for example, who are driving the Society 5.0. Japan replenishes their retail stores 3 times a day. So overnight, they'll replenish the retail stores with grab-and-go breakfast. In the morning, they'll replenish with grab-and-go lunch. And in the early afternoon, they'll replenish the stores again with grab-and-go dinners. So in order to do that, you need to have the infrastructure and capability in place. 5G will play a key role, but interoperability is critical of all of the components, and the orchestration of that is vitally important. So the data problem, we've had a massive explosion in data demands and also data creation and data generation. So how do we deal with that? Well, to be quite honest, if I was up in front of 1,000 CEOs in the food industry today, I would tell all of them confidently, no, not arrogantly, but confidently, I would tell them that not one of them has accurate data within their companies, because it's nearly impossible to do it. And the issue here is that most companies don't understand the basics of master data management. And in some cases, a company or even a system or a database will be reliant on what we call custodian database, or custodian data, where they're not actually the creator of that data, but it comes from another source. They're storing it, and it becomes critical to feed into their business processes. So the notion of master data, transactional data, event data, and also custodianship versus the authoritative source, these become critical components. And we could do a whole webinar just on that. And I think in the next month or two, GS1 will do a webinar to actually explain the data component and how to get that right. But here's a slide, compliments of Origin Trail. Origin Trail are a not-for-profit blockchain protocol, not a blockchain, but a protocol based on GS1 standards that try to solve that data problem. The issue that we have today, we envision, and actually this is the way it works today, we have linear supply chains, and our mind thinks that way as well, that we have a linear supply chain. But the problem that we have today is actually regulation is holding us back. It's the same as in 1896 when we had these things called motorized vehicles. They were only allowed to drive 4 miles per hour during daylight, and somebody had to walk in front of it with a red flag, and at nighttime with a red lantern. So we were over-regulated way back then, and it's the same with food. Now, our government are hesitant to come in and over-regulate the food industry, because the food industry lobby is quite significant. But industry have not yet stepped up to try to solve this problem. One step up, one step back is actually holding us back. So the model that's evolving from this is actually a blockchain-centric model. So here you have a linear supply chain where everyone has a stovepipe. They're not sharing data. And if they are sharing data, it's only a number of attributes. But if you're beyond the party that's sharing it, if you're a processor, you can't see what's going on in warehousing. Or if you're a distributor, you can't see what's happening up at the retailer level. Blockchain will put in what's called a hub and spoke here and changes the frame and how we share the data and how we execute. This is quite important change. So regulation is holding us back. This one step up, one step back is actually holding us back. This is my view on the data situation in the food industry today. We're just putting out fires. We're not solving the problem structurally, and again, GS1 will address this in an upcoming webinar. So let's pick on blockchain for a moment. There's a lot of humor going around about blockchain, and why not share some of that? So the humor, of course, is nice. Some people get frustrated with it. Bless our blockchain down here. To where's the future? It's blockchain, Marty. So getting serious, when we look at what we're hearing about unhackability, timestamping, trusted protocol, verifiability, and so on. But we also hear about smart contracts and encryption. And I want to point out, for those who are not quite familiar with this blockchain, is that smart contracts and encryption are not part of blockchain. They're not, smart contracts predates Bitcoin blockchain by 11 or 12 years. So we had smart contracts way before that. Plus, we can implement a blockchain without smart contracts and vice versa. Encryption we've had, for thousands of years in various forms. And of course, since Turing from the Second World War, we've had various types of encryption. So the argument from researchers is that most of the value coming from blockchains today is actually coming from smart contracts and encryption. And of course, a little bit of humor here, the CEO brain activity on the right after listening to all the hype and the scientific diagnosis pending. Now, for those of you who actually know that slide, the picture on the right is, of course, after 15 minutes of walking. So here's one of my favorite academics. This is Professor Hannah Halliburton. She was up to mid last year. She was the chief economist at the Bank of Canada, and now she's back as a professor with New York Stern Business School. So she talks about what I mentioned earlier. A more careful look into the technology reveals that most of the benefits don't actually come from blockchain. And she talks about smart contracts, encryption, and distributed ledgers are separate concepts. And of course, blockchain is part of the family of distributed ledger. It's not an interchangeable term. We've had distributed ledgers for 30 plus years. So blockchain should be seen as just one component of that. And then she changes the paradigm even again and says that, well, you know what, blockchain is not a technology per se, it's an outcome. It's an outcome. And the way I articulate that in some papers and in discussions is that we have to view a particular blockchain as a configuration of multiple technologies, tools, and methods that solve or address a particular business problem. And of course, she says as well that the only thing we cannot do with today's technology is cryptocurrency. So there's food for thought. I've put the links in here as well. You can go and listen to her. She's quite brilliant. She focuses a lot as well on game theory. Now, so here's my argument here. The food chain trust has two big enemies: bad character and bad data. We can address the bad data, again, if we drive towards, as a baseline in the food industry, using GS1 standards, and also if we put in interoperable systems, again, GS1 can help with that. But the bad character we can never address. It has been with us for thousands of years, and we have to be able to plan for it. So if we're putting in blockchain systems, we have to look at where are the vulnerabilities in the system and how could somebody try to cheat us. So the way I explain that is that bad data added to a blockchain creates a false sense of trust. So in that context, bad data entered into a blockchain becomes an immutable lie. So I've argued in some papers that for various reasons in the food industry, things go wrong. Plus also we'll have criminal intent that will be adding bad information or corrupt information to a blockchain. We need to consider from a research perspective the mutability of blockchains, not only immutable. And that gets strengthened from an argument when we look at Society 5.0 and we look at our privacy laws and the human or citizens, the citizen consumer's right to be forgotten on platforms as well. So immutable lies is something that is important. And I've been into numerous discussions where companies have actually wanted to do that, give that false sense of trust by using a blockchain. So when the discussion comes to blockchain, there seems to be no middle ground. It's either hyping or bashing. Here, we've gone through that, the buy-sell hype, but still there's not a lot of people that were sitting down to understand how blockchain works itself. Hence, coming out of that, it's either a silver bullet or it's bullshit. And the arguments keep going from there. But what Professor Hannah Halliburton says is that optimism in the face of novelty and uncertainty of new technology is not a new concept, but she cautions that when it starts to interfere with the market and when people are making promises of very strong cost savings or benefits without giving evidence, then it becomes a real issue for us. So this is where I see blockchain today. It's got a head, it's got an ass. It's got two legs, but it's not filled out yet. And it's not filled out because we don't have all the use cases yet. And for those who are focused on blockchain, it really has to be use case driven and use case focused. It's not a blanket that it'll solve all of our problems today. But intellectually, we know what it is, we know where it's going, and we know where we can use it as well. So two professors at Harvard also cautioned us not to be using the term disruptive with blockchain. We need to start thinking about it like TCP/IP, that it's foundational. It will be built in. It will give us unprecedented societal benefits, but it's going to take us decades to implement that. So the net of what they're saying is be patient, people. It will come, but at the right time and the right place. And that's really, really important. So transparency, this is of course, my favorite topic. What is transparency? Well, it's about sincerity, honesty, truth, accuracy, and so on. As it relates to the food chain, it's about really telling the truth. And truth is really, really important here. If you ever get into a room where somebody is talking about radical transparency, run out the door. We should not be even having a conversation about radical transparency. We should be having conversations about simple forms of transparency, really simple stuff. So let's look at the definition of this. I've been using this one for years, and it's from Professor Geert-Jan Hofstede from Holland. Some of you may remember his father, Professor Geert Hofstede. He's the one that did the cultural studies back in the 80s. That's his father. This is the son. And he's at Wageningen University. But I love this because we can spend, again, a whole day on the definition. Transparency of a net chain. The net chain here is the network, and the supply chain is the extent to which all the net chain stakeholders have a shared understanding. Now, shared understanding is critical here because, again, GS1 standards can help us to get a shared understanding of the data and what it means. And of course, access to, if you have data but nobody has access to it, you fail. And it's product-related information that they request. I have a company in China who I was talking to, the CEO, and she said, John, we made a big mistake, but we were excited beforehand. And I said, what did you do? And she said, well, we have an online platform and our customers are mainly moms. We advocate for safe, affordable, organic food, chemical and pesticide-free. So what they did was they put 14, 15-page PDFs on file for each product so the consumers can download them. The feedback from the consumers, they thought the feedback would be, oh, fantastic, well done, we're really happy with this. But the feedback was the opposite. The feedback was, you scared us, we didn't ask for it, and we didn't need it. We don't need it. So you have to be transparent with information that they request. And again, without loss, noise, delay, or distortion. The loss can come from a lack of interoperability, a lack of standards. The noise can come from, again, I don't want to pick on marketing too much here, but noise can get into the system. We've had large food companies recently in the last couple of months who have agreed not to use the terms healthy, wholesome, and nutritious on their food products. We also have delay in sharing data. Again, this could be an interoperability issue or a lack of standards, and distortion can come from various sides as well. The net of all of this is that even products as simple as an apple, you need to be transparent. And I was in New Zealand with a government official, and we went to visit the CEO and management team of an apple producer. And the apple producer said to me, he said, John, this is great. I love this stuff on transparency. But he said, do you think it's in the interest of New Zealand consumers to know that the apple could have sat in a barrel in a dark room for 8 months before it got to the supermarket? And I said, absolutely. And I said, what are the other things that are going on that consumers should know? And he said, well, to be honest, we actually outsource the growing of our apples to Portland, Oregon in the US. And we bring them back and we sell them as New Zealand apples, New Zealand grown. So I think there are things that consumers do need to know, especially because it's in another country and they're not possibly aware that the product has traveled that journey. Also, if the product is genetically modified, it's only fair to notify the consumer. And we know that consumers are confused about ingredients. The literacy is quite poor. The US are moving towards dual nutritional labeling now, not just for single serving, but they've looked at consumer behavior, and consumers will eat a whole tub of ice cream, for example. So what they're doing now on the nutrition label is putting in not only the 100 grams, the calories and nutrients for 100 grams, but also for the complete pack. Again, this is looking at consumer behavior and then labeling accordingly. But we believe that there is a great opportunity for brands to gain more trust by increasing the transparency of their products. Now, all of this doesn't have to go on the actual labels itself. Think of the GS1 identifier or a GS1-centric QR code, or what they're doing with GS1 is really, they have what's called a digital link that can link to the physical product, link the physical product to the digital product. So twinning, creating a digital twin for that product, which can show you the complete journey of that product and more information about it as well. So look up the digital link, and again, that will be covered in a future webinar. So on trust, so what is trust? Rousseau got together with some academics a while ago and came up with this definition. There are about 140 different definitions of trust, and of course you can look at trust, interpersonal trust, B2B trust, trust in government. There's many, many different angles and viewpoints. It is multifaceted for sure. But in this context, it's a psychological state comprising of the intention to accept a vulnerability based on the positive expectations and the intentions or behaviors of another. So think about it this way. You go into a restaurant. When you go into a restaurant, you're accepting a vulnerability and you have a positive expectation of the intentions of everyone in that supply chain and the behavior of everybody in that supply chain to have that, bring that product to your plate in a safe manner. So the product's got the right quality and it's got the right safety and it's prepared properly. This is really what it's about. So put yourself into this definition to really understand what it's all about. And these are parts of the issue. And what I want to draw on here is that we talk about transparency builds trust. That's true. But trust is actually an antecedent and an outcome of transparency. Because here, what you're doing is you're trusting because you're accepting the vulnerability. So you are taking the first step as a consumer, then the company is transparent, and then the trust comes after that. So trust comes before transparency, and it's an outcome of transparency, what we call an antecedent and an outcome of it. So think about it that way as well. But we know that we can trust all we want, but this trust but verify is critically important in the supply chain. So where blockchain, IoT devices can help, say to you, give you the promise that the product is from X location, the only way to verify that the true provenance of the product is with analytical chemistry, which is important. Now, trust has declined across sectors. This is the Edelman Trust Barometer that came out. This is the comparison between 2019 and 2020. So you look at in the middle there, food and beverage has gone down 2%. On the left-hand side, consumer packaged goods is low, financial services is very poor, and surprising, technology is the highest, but it's also gone down one of the most at -4%. Now, or 4 points. I'll come back to that later because it's vitally important. Trust in technology is vitally important. Now, this is something that I want to go through very quickly based on time, but imagine your company is looking for a strategic partner to manufacture widgets. And I actually did this at some workshops in the US last year. So you have company A, and they have a long history of high quality widgets and delivering on time and cost. However, the leadership of the company has been accused of some unethical behavior, such as treating employees badly or contractors. And there may be rumors in the system about sustainability issues, slavery, bribery, and so on. Company B has no experience or history in manufacturing widgets, and they have not been the most reliable partner in the past. However, the leadership is known for dealing in an honest and transparent manner in all aspects of their business. So what we have in this case, and when I ask people about this, most of them will say they choose company A. A few people, I'd say maybe 5%, will choose company B. And when I ask them why would they choose company A, because they go, look, I get measured on cost, quality, and delivery. That's my measurement. I'm not measured on the CEO's ethical behavior in a company in Vietnam or China. I'm not measured on that company's supplier in Borneo on whether they chop down forests and cause habitat loss. I'm not measured on human slavery or child labor. So this is why I choose company A. But when we look at this, we look at two different measurements of trust. We look at trust from a competence perspective and integrity perspective. So company A has got what's called high competence, but low integrity. Company B has got high integrity, but low competence. So I've mapped those onto this slide here. So here are our two companies, firm A and firm B. So firm A gains what's called competency-based trust, which may lead to adverse selection. In other words, you may be signing up the wrong partner. And subsequently, higher transaction costs for contract negotiations, because again, they're dishonest. And the post-contractual moral hazard, which is the risk of opportunism. In other words, the risk here is significant that the company will do things that may cause reputational issues. So this is why companies need to get a balance between competence and integrity. This is critically important. And firm B, of course, they have their integrity-based trust, which assumes the alignment of values and motives, and it may lead to lower transaction costs over time. Now, in fact, it actually does, because what Conneely found in 2015 is that integrity-based trust was 10 times more effective at reducing transaction costs over time. And again, think of here the risks to your reputation. You may be getting a high-quality product, the right cost, and it's delivered on time all the time, but the risk of opportunism, what we call here moral hazard, or hidden actions or hidden behaviors, is significant. And in some cases, we can use technology to control that. So this forms a big part of my own research area. And strangely enough, so while I've been using that for a couple of years, I was delighted to see that this year, this past month, that the Edelman Trust Barometer came out and said that trust is all about competence and ethics. I was delighted to see that. And in fact, they looked at ethics, which is what I talked about again. Integrity is, they combine integrity with dependability and purpose. And you can see here how important it is. 76% say that this is more important, and competence is only 24% of the trust equation. So this again verifies the work that Conneely et al. Did, and just proves that integrity, dependability, purpose, the alignment of the values are important. And I'll come back to this at the very, very last slide, where I pull together transparency and trust. Now, here's the problem. In the Edelman Trust Barometer, when they looked at who is ethical, NGOs came out as the only ones that were actually ethical. They protect the environment, they protect civil and human rights, and also poverty and illiteracy and disease. They're purpose-driven, they're honest, they have a vision, and they're fair. This is quite interesting. So what the survey said is that businesses and governments are unethical. But believe it or not, this is no surprise, businesses were competent. So how can we get the balance? So if businesses are competent and we rely on them to supply to us, but yet they're not ethical. And in some cases, we have ethical organizations like Greenpeace and others who do the dirty work. Literally, they go out and do the dirty work. So competent organizations need to use the ethical views or opinions and feedback and evidence provided by organizations like Greenpeace to be able to drive more transparency. And in this context, you know, some of the big companies in the past, they would turn away Greenpeace and these companies with evidence. They would say, you know, they'd push them away. But now I think to be really transparent means that you have to be prepared for the good and the bad in your supply chain. And you have to be able to celebrate the problems that you find. Way back when I was doing my MBA 25 years ago, I implemented the learning organization concepts from Peter Senge, which were very, very important. So I'd have my team in the Netherlands celebrating every time they found a mistake. So if somebody made a mistake, we used to celebrate that and we say, you know what, we made that mistake once, let's not repeat that. Let's figure out how we can change our SOPs to solve that. So celebrating the problems rather than hiding them and burying them. Now, I know in some cultures that's easier to do than in others where face saving is critically important. So let's jump on to Society 5.0. This is coming out of Japan. I want to just show you here that it's not the same as Industry 4.0 or Industry 5.0. So if we look at the evolution of society, it's different from the Industrial Revolution. So one is with the E and the other one is with the R. So on the society, we started off as hunter-gatherers, then we went to the agrarian, farming, up to the industrial society, information society, and the next one is this Society 5.0, which is human-centric, and we still have to fill in the blanks. And somewhat in parallel, but not in the same timeline, we have, of course, the Industrial Revolution, and we're talking now about Industry 5.0. And Industry 5.0 will more likely be around trust. How can we build in trust? So I just want to compare these two with you or let you see this in this context, that they're not the same. Industry 4.0 and Society 4.0 are different. And the reason why that's important is that Society 5.0 is guided by a human-centric approach. It's guided by openness, sustainability, and inclusiveness. And it's also experimentation-driven. What Japan warns is that do not take a technology-first approach. Industry 5.0, or 4.0 and 5.0, is leading with technology. Society 4.0 and Society 5.0 is leading with the human. This is very important. They also caution not to take an economy first, and also not to take an expert opinion first. So when we think about that, and we think about a human-centric approach, we see some fascinating things happening now in healthcare. And this is something that where AI, machine learning, we're seeing now that machines can actually diagnose images much quicker and much faster and sometimes more accurate than the human eye of an expert doctor or a specialist. So we see some brilliant things happening. We also see the rise of the IoT-based cobots. A cobot is a collaborative robot that works with humans. So whereas a robot would work autonomously, the cobot would actually work side by side with the human. And in this case here, you can see in the future society in Japan, you can see cobots that are helping aged. And also on the bottom right-hand side, you can see a cobot which is actually monitoring the person, and if they fall, they would call for help in some cases. So this is how cobots are starting to evolve and get into our life. In the future, Society 5.0, we need to put the human at the center and say, what are the needs of humans in the future, and how can we help them? These are, of course, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, from no poverty, zero hunger. And many of these map to initiatives going on within companies today. And several of them map to supply chain and food chain as well. I'll go into that in a few moments. Many companies out there now are looking at their business plans and looking at their strategic direction, and they're mapping their plans to the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you go onto the UN website, they have the 17 goals mapped out, and they actually show you the partnerships that they have developed in each of those goals, and they have very structured plans. It's one of the most foundational changes that we're making moving forward, and I think it's brilliant. This is how you map it all together. This is from Japan again. So here you have Society 5.0 for SDGs, and you can see all of the technologies that wrap around here that make the vision a reality. If I just pick on one here for the sake of time, life below water, number 14 on the left-hand side, using remote sensing and oceanographic data for monitoring and management of water quality, forest lands, degradation, and so on. Canada launched 2 or 3 satellites about 3 months ago, and those satellites can map all of the world's oceans, or more than 90% of the world's oceans, every 24 hours. So there's a lot of benefit in using those. So I don't want to go into the depth of this, but you will have this afterwards, and I would recommend you go to Society 5.0 and go to the Japanese website to get more information. We're starting to pull a look at Society 5.0 from an SDG perspective, and then overlaying the technology onto that to see where can the technology help us. But again, It's based on the SDG goals, which are human-centric as well. Again, I won't go through this one in too much detail, but in Society 5.0, it's about problem solving, it's about experimentation, it's about building resilience and more harmony. So if you look at United Arab Emirates and Dubai in particular, Dubai actually have a happiness goal. And everything that they do is based on creating more happiness for society. So you could look at that as well as something that's quite interesting. Here's the one I talked about. This is quite an interesting paper from the World Economic Forum, and it looks at traceability in the food value chain, and it picks out 5 of the SDGs that align with traceability in the food chain that companies can look at. And I think this is quite interesting for you to look at. So now let's look at innovation and use cases pretty quickly. We know that we have precision farming going on. We have smart farms, we have survey drones, we have fleets of agrobots, we have texting cows, smart tractors, and really, really brilliant things going on at the farm level. And this is vitally important. Again, if you go into the SDGs, they're looking at how can each technology take out either waste or add value into the farm. So things like blockchain, for example, is envisioned that it could take out 1 to 2% of food waste. IoT devices can also benefit. So we're not only looking at the smart farm, but if you overlay the SDGs on top of this and then overlay the technologies, then you can start to see where the benefits are coming from. So the technology is helping us with farming and with smart farming and the future of farming. But we also have what we call the connected cow, and many different technologies that are in and on the cow as an example. So in the UK, they were losing cows because they were becoming distressed during birthing. And again, an animal behavioralist said, you know what? I know a technology that could go on the cow's tail. And if the cow gets into distress, they wag their tail significantly. So that then would send an alert to the farmer and to the veterinarian that the cow is distressed, and they would deal with that. So you can reduce the mortality rate for both the mother and the calf during birthing. This is an interesting one here, and also for a small farm. So one farmer had just 20 cows, and he detected through pulling the data together that 3 of the cows in the herd were eating twice as much as the others, but they were producing about half of the milk. So then think about it from this context. They started then to include the genetics of the animals into the overall picture. And they found that the 3 cows were actually sisters, genetically sisters. So those 3 cows ended up as hamburgers. So this is just an example of optimizing the herd. Up to 9 behaviors being monitored. Now, of course, we have massive technology applications as well in precision manufacturing and warehouse optimization, logistics, right down to smart glasses. And we're going through dealing with some of the issues with smart glasses, with privacy and so on, and the benefits. They're still heating up a lot and causing discomfort, but they can add significant value, not only in the food chain and food service, but also in warehouse operations. And Walmart has actually implemented drones to do inventory checks in their warehouses. So a drone flies around, and what used to take 30 days is now taking 1 day. They got it automated using a drone. So lots of really good experimentation going on. And of course, when you get down to the retail level as well, you're talking about AR, VR, and some fantastic technologies that will help us not only look at products, but also go in and touch literally go in and touch the augmented reality of the product and be able to turn it around and play with it. Again, you're talking about a digital twin or a perfect copy of the physical product. This is something that's quite interesting. This was done last year. This is the University of Illinois with Kansas State University. They actually mapped the food flows between counties in the US. This is the brilliant project using open source data. But the important thing about this is that they identified in red here, these are the states that if anything happened to the supply in these counties, it would significantly impact the food chain in the United States. Now, for all the Canadians on the phone, some of these red states down here in red places, red counties in California, for example, they give us 75 to 90% of our vegetables in the winter months. So it's not only the US that's impacted, it's also Canada. Now, the question is, could we do this in your country? And this is where technology is important. And this leads from that. And this is an example. I met the CEO of Hello Tractor, and they're from Nigeria. And the CEO, I met him in Vietnam, and this is a fantastic example of how an integrated platform can deliver value for multiple stakeholders at the same time. Now, they're working with IBM on this, but look at this from the tractor owner's perspective. So they can use machine learning and IoT on the tractors to be able to view and manage the fleet, and also look at utilization and history and so on. But also there's more that can be learned from that. But then the farmer will be able to predict when and where and how to go and actually harvest their crop. So they're using remote sensing IoT devices and some business analytics, including IBM's weather company, to get data to look at the optimum time to actually harvest and then schedule one of the tractors. Essentially what this is the Uber for tractors. But it gets better from there, because dealers can also look at this and they can benefit from doing predictive maintenance on the tractors and servicing. But they can also look at, you know what, if the fleet is over utilized, they can bring more or offer more units and put them into circulation. And this is interesting. The banks can also look at the data, and they can look at the farmer's performance. So if they've loaned $100,000 to a farmer, but he's got significantly high utilization on his tractors, that will impact his credit rating, free up credit for other things. It could be for labor, for seeding, for other things outside of that. But you get the message here. It's about an integrated platform that delivers significant value. In this context, the farmers in Africa would be way ahead of the farming in Canada from an integrated perspective. And then you look at the government, and the government can actually utilize the actionable insights because they know what's being harvested. If the government is responsible for, let's say, the rail or trucks and that will pick up this, they can look at food security at the macro level. They can also look at what's being harvested, when is it being harvested, and where is it being stored. And where it's being stored, if there's a bumper harvest, for example, they don't have enough storage, then you run the risk of contamination and spoilage, what we call food loss at that early stage in post-harvest. So again, a great example. Now we're going to go on to IoT, and I bet you thought it was only for the Internet of Things, but I'm going to show you the Internet of Toilets. And this is a little bit of humor, but I just want to give you an example and tease you with regard to what's possible, again, within the context of Society 5.0. So you can imagine, again, this is Japanese, the future toilets or washrooms. You could have, a green light coming out of the washroom in the middle of the night. The green light would be an indicator that the weather tomorrow morning is going to be good. But it could also be that, it could tell you that what you've produced is not good. If it's red, it could be indicate a problem. And of course, there's no reason why we can't do analytical testing of what's produced. Governments are doing this all over the world today. They can tell you in the major cities around the world, based on testing in the sewers, what recreational and pharmaceutical grade drugs are used in each city. Now, the reason that's important is because it gets back into the food chain. And we know from research off the coast of Seattle in the US last year that human pharmaceuticals, human sedatives, in fact, they're impacting and changing the brain behavior of fish. So we need to understand more, and analytical chemistry becomes our best friend. But what if all of these things at home becomes personal screening that are sent to your health service provider? Your diet is adjusted, and you automatically get those products sent to you. Again, think about this as precision consumption, or as Professor Dubé often calls precision retailing. So this is where it's all going, smart living. Now, this is an older slide, but it's about smart retail, precision retail with smart home. And there's a joke out there with a cartoon where a guy is talking to his wife and he's saying, darling, we have to go out for dinner because the refrigerator is not talking to the stove. Now, a little bit of humor again, but we are putting a lot more technology into our homes and we're becoming dependent on it in some cases. So this case, we have the smart home connected with smart retail. What could be the demand for different products? Smart agriculture could be connected with smart health. In the Society 5.0 context, smart health should be feeding back into smart agriculture. In other words, we should be feeding back information about fortification of some foods. When I was living in Vietnam, there are 4 micronutrients missing in the diets of childbearing women, especially in the mountainous regions. And you can talk about putting those micronutrients into like rice or into oils and so on. So this is very, very important. There was research done by Australia last year, which looked at 10 countries. And they looked at the sodium, sugar, and oils, saturated fats. And Canada, believe it or not, had the highest sodium levels of all 10 countries as measured in across those 10 countries. So that high sodium level, which is quite surprising, that needs to be fed back to in this case, the food processors for reformulation, but also innovation and developing new products. So we need to connect our health systems in with agriculture and in with the food companies so we can allow them to innovate and develop better products. Smart retail with smart health, and of course, smart home with smart agriculture as well. All this is about convergence, and this is where we're going to. We're converging all of these things together within the context of Society 5.0. So now my very, very last slide, our second last slide. Trust is important. This again is an Edelman slide. Trust matters to everybody, consumers, employees, regulators, investors. And then some of the investors right now are looking at transparency and trust as key decision criteria and whether they will invest in some companies. So again, going back to that company earlier that had high confidence with low integrity, that low integrity would impact currently on some investors' ability to invest in that company if there's a significant risk to the reputation of that company. So that's something to consider. This is the other key part here is that as technology develops and it's moving fast, some argue that the genie is already out of the box with regard to facial recognition, and we can't put it back in the bottle. But consumers are saying, or citizens are saying, that the pace of change is too fast. They worry about technology, and they worry that governments don't fully understand the impact of the emerging technology. My message from this slide, and you can see here on the right-hand side, Canada is in one of those countries that we have a large decline in our trust in technology. Part of that has been, scandals where we are being hacked, our health system is being hacked, our health providers are being hacked, and massive amounts of data has been stolen. So my message here is that we need to take citizen consumers on the journey with us. This is very important. Education is absolutely critical to make sure that we can survive in this Society 5.0. So my final slide, pulling it all together. I won't spend too long on this because I'm quite conscious of the time. But on the left-hand side, you have 3 levels of transparency. On the right-hand side, you have 3 levels of trust. Go down to the bottom here on the left-hand side with history-based transparency and calculus-based trust. These are obligatory and mandatory. History-based transparency is like looking in the rearview mirror. What happened in my supply chain? Calculus-based trust, this is the area where companies put in very strong contracts to mitigate the risk of opportunism and to kind of force compliance so that they have this big stick over their suppliers. But it's also where governments put in regulations. And look at the basis of that here. The basis is actually mistrust. And in some cases, it's distrust. Now, the difference, with trust we went through earlier, mistrust is generally seen as based on experience, whereas distrust is based on suspicion. And they're very, very different. So the obligatory nature of contracts and regulation is a blend of mistrust and distrust. But we have to move out of that area and up to where trust building is voluntary. Now, as we move up from operations-based transparency and knowledge-based trust, where you're sharing what's going on a day-to-day basis, again, company A was not doing this, but company B was. And then you get up to strategic transparency. And I use the example here of Walmart with their Mango use case using blockchain. So I can only imagine, I wasn't in the room, but I can only imagine that Walmart engaged in a strategic transparency discussion with those Mango suppliers. And there was a bi-directional flow of information. They took out the fear, which is very common as you try to propose new technology. But they talked about the future. They talked about how they were going to grow the Mango development of the market in the United States. So the focus was on the future. They're sharing their plans, and then you have a symbiotic relationship where they grow together. Similarly, on the right-hand side with identification-based trust, again, think of integrity and competence, what I talked about earlier. This is where Walmart, most likely, again, as I said, I wasn't there, but most likely shared with those Mango suppliers about how they bring products to market. They want the very high quality product. They want consumers to enjoy the product at the lowest cost every day. I think something like that is their tagline. And I can imagine that the Mango supplier said, well, we want that too. We want American consumers to enjoy the products in the best condition possible. So yes, you buy into that, and it's only when you buy into that, then you can start using technology, IoT, AI, machine learning, blockchain, and so on. But you have to get up to that level. My key point here, a few key points. You have to bring transparency and trust together. You have to mature them together. You can't just focus on one. So for example, if Walmart only focused on strategic transparency, but they were using calculus-based trust, in other words, very strong contracts with penalties, it would be misbalanced or out of balance. This is not to say that you don't need contracts in place, but you need to develop suppliers not only based on their competence, but also on their integrity. And in some cases, if I go back to company B, how would a company like Walmart or another manufacturer deal with that? Well, within economics, we talk about asset specificity. Asset specificity is where you can put in either advanced technologies or humans to train them. So that company that never produced high quality or to spec before, you can actually work closely with them to put in technology that will help them get to that level. You can also put in some people with the expertise to help them get to that level. So there are ways to help company B come up. The key message here, you have to bring transparency and trust along together. Don't only focus on competence-based trust because integrity is critical. And the way to go here is a good balance between strategic transparency and the buy-in at the intentions, the values, and the norms. And that's it. I'll pass over to Laurette.
Okay, I am unmuted, yes?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, John. You're such a wealth of knowledge and good academic and solid common sense. I will start with a few questions, and then we will follow with questions from the floor, where I believe Sabina will unmute you, and you then identify yourself and you ask a question. 2 or 3 points, John, that I found very interesting and challenging, starting with your last one, where you say, you talk about the importance of moving in parallel the transparency and the trust. And I would like to hear a bit more, what are your thoughts there, how to move forward? Because transparency, it's about data, it's about standard, it's about so many pieces that have to be connected to so many actors, and the trust is you get the human and communication component on this. So that's the first part that I would like to you to elaborate further. And then back to the blockchain, which have been, as you said, very much hype, and you have talked about many things that blockchain does not do, but within the context of where we are currently, what do you see as the contribution of blockchain within that ecosystem of building trust and transparency? So if you can address those two questions, and then we will be opening the floor.
Yeah, I think they're very important conversations to have. As I mentioned earlier, companies should not engage in what's called radical transparency. They need to really figure out what do they want to be transparent about. So if it's a product, you can start very simply with the origin of that product, how it was processed. But you can't, like if the product is from Vietnam as an example, and you're claiming that it's organic, well, we know that Vietnam has problems because they have significant contamination from Agent Orange. We know that the Ho Chi Minh as a city is sinking, so the arsenic levels in reservoir water, underground water, is actually increasing as a result. So if you were to be transparent about, let's say, Vietnam as the source of provenance, you would need to have a qualified, independent, and trusted third party that could use a blockchain. But before blockchain, they need to be able to test that independently. In some countries, you still have corruption even in the laboratory. You have corruption at the government level. So I was speaking with a German expert who's responsible for imports. And an example, products that are coming in from China, the Chinese government as the competent authority may check those for 5 pesticides. When they arrive in Germany, they check them for 300 pesticides because they know that there's a risk in that area, that country, for more pesticides. So I would say take it simple on transparency and look at how do we build trust around that. Origin is one, and I would say keep it simple. Don't get into wild notions about radical transparency. Blockchain can help in this case because in cases where a laboratory does provide the certificate of analysis or its test results, if they can append that to the product where the brand owner cannot change it, then we have traceability back to the laboratory, and at least we know that somebody in that laboratory is accountable and responsible for that. So in building integrity into our systems, blockchain can actually add a lot of value by its immutability and not permitting a brand to change the results of from a laboratory. Again, this goes back to the notion of authoritative source versus custodian source. So if you have a system that's architected, the authoritative source should be providing the data into that system. You should not be getting it from custodian sources, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. Is there a question from the floor? I'm told by Sabina that you need to let her know, and she will unmute you. Sabina, why don't you unmute everyone, even if it's a bit noisy, just to see if, because I'm not very good in checking the.
Hello, John. Thank you so much for the very interesting presentation. My name is. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. My name is Atefe, and I just finished my PhD under supervision of Professor Dubé. I have a quick question regarding evolving trust and transparency in tandem with each other. So where do you see the role of large players? I'm thinking about large food manufacturers in pushing this transition toward more transparent food supply chain, particularly in contexts and industries where we deal with very like small scale commodity producers. I'm thinking about, for example, poultry or meat production supply chain. So where do you see the role of big players, big manufacturers in this process of pushing for enhancing integrity and persuading those smaller players, like, for example, upstream farmers, to get on board?
Yeah, I'm echoing here, so I don't know if I can respond.
Please.
I'm echoing. I can hear myself. So for some reason, it's very difficult for me to talk.
So maybe you remute everyone except Isabelle Garnier will be asking the next question, so he can address at the phase. Go ahead.
Test. You can hear me okay? Yeah, that's a great question. We have a lot of very, very competent retailers who are buying from suppliers at all different levels. We also have a lot of processors who are buying. So if you have a company like Walmart, for example, and although they're a retailer and they'll have some own brand interests as well, Walmart are actually developing, in some cases, 500,000 or 1 million suppliers in countries like China and previously in India. So the competency that the large organizations have and their ability to do capacity building is astronomical. The other thing I would say is that because of the democratization of technologies, we now have small players who could be part of an association, let's say a dairy association in Ontario or outside, who now at the association level can get access to the technology. And if they get access to the technology, then they can start pulling in the other stakeholders who are important. So for example, if they have a laboratory who's doing testing on, let's say it's milk, if I can just pick on that, they can provide that certificate or analysis work into the platform itself. Then they can put up their hand and say to the big suppliers, or the big buyers, that we're here, we're open for business, and by the way, we have a lot of integrity. This is actually where it needs to occur. The big companies are very, very competent. The smaller companies, the smaller processors, they still have a weakness in access to technology and access. I would say the biggest, probably the weakest link is their access to laboratory level science. This is why I mentioned earlier with companies like Swiss Decode and also at Guelph University, they have mobile technology, which is cost competitive, that can actually go out there. You don't always have to bring the products into a laboratory. So we need to break down the science. We need to make the science more accessible to small farmers and help them understand what testing needs to get done to be attractive to the big buyers. And the big buyers are doing their part in capacity building. So I'm very confident in that area based on what I see. In fact, next week, I'm with a technology company in the US who works with 20,000 plus suppliers. And we're actually having that discussion at a very deep level. Technology is a critical role, but I would say the number one thing, authoritative source versus custodian source, having all of the stakeholders participate in the platform. Blockchain can be a key part of that. So in that context, we can mature transparency and trust at the same time.
Thank you, John. Isabelle, I believe you wanted to ask a question. Is it the case?
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay. So yeah, it's very a broad question, and I'm not sure there's an answer. Based on your example at the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned a lot of practices that are misleading, voluntarily misleading, or not necessarily. And I'm wondering, most of the consumer would be shocked to learn how much unsustainable and how misleading those behavior from food companies and food distributors are. And I'm wondering if that opening the gate of transparency now to the whole world wouldn't have so much long-lasting negative impact that it must reconsider the I don't know, the way that we open to the general public is to make sure that we don't create mistrust and negative impact on the food chain in the general public. So how do you see that? How do you think we have to handle this transition to transparency? It's for sure much needed.
Yeah, I think that's it's a great question. I'll use an example. For those who are not familiar with this case in Canada, we had what's called Breadgate, where our largest retailer and retailers colluded for more than a decade to fix the price of bread. Now, this was a big shock, and allegedly the ringleader, so our largest retailer, they became the whistleblower. And as part of the whistleblowing mechanism within the competition law in Canada had the first competition law in the world in the late 1800s, before, I think, a year before the US had it. So we have a long history with that, but we haven't been enforcing it up to recently, as far as I can see. But in this case, the perpetrator of the crime, they became the whistleblower and they got immunity from prosecution. Then they said, mea culpa. We were bad. We did these things. We admit it. And some of the other companies were kicking and screaming, saying that it wasn't them, and so on. But outside of that, Loblaws decided to give a $25 voucher as part of that mea culpa. You know, we made a mistake to Canadians. But unfortunately, they created more mistrust and distrust by doing that. So on the one hand, they were transparent, owning up to the problem. Then they tried to fix the problem. But in fixing the problem, they created a PR problem for themselves. Because when they offered the $25 voucher, they started off and some consumers were asked for their driver's license or for a utility bill. Now, the privacy commissioner said that that's out of line. You shouldn't be doing that for a $25 voucher. And then others complained to the privacy commissioner because Loblaws was actually selling the data that you provided them to a company in the US and a company in El Salvador, which was really very, very bizarre. So when you look at that from a consumer perspective, your suspicions are increased. So in that case, the trust that the consumer that you have with the consumer is being abused. In this case, the privacy commissioner sided with Loblaws. They said that they were not sharing a lot of information or a lot of what we call PII, personally identifiable information, outside of Canada. So that case didn't move forward. So companies moving forward in transparency need to be prepared to deal with the good and the bad. And that's the key thing. Today, what companies will do is that they'll use the 4D model. Deny, defer, defend, defeat. And one of those will be on the first pin of the bowling alley strategy. Normally it's deny. Companies need to be more open for this journey of transparency. And transparency journey is not for the faint-hearted. Companies need to reframe how they deal with consumers and in a transparent world. Because if they don't do that, mistrust and distrust will just continue.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, John, and thanks, Isabelle, for that question. We have reached 12:29, so we need to get closure on this webinar, which was extremely thoughtful and inspiring, John. Thank you very much. Our next two presentations will be building upon John's presentation, and 2 weeks ago we had Peter Shellstraight on clean packaging. The next one, we don't have a date yet, but it should be in the coming month, will be by Kevin Dean from GS1. GS1, as John was mentioning a couple of times, it's a very key standard and governance actors in this whole complex ecosystem. And we will be advancing our understanding of of how to move forward in as effective way as possible. And the month after will be Sean Brown, who is the director of the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center and was at McGill until very recently, and a very close collaborator in building this digital powered approach to convergence in the context of food. So thank you very much. John, do you have a last burning comment before we close?
I think we are one bite away from the next food safety crisis. We need to be alert, and unsafe food is not food.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.